Thank you all for coming out. It's good to see you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my book and about some of the implications of the book. I want to start by telling you how I came to write it, because I was actually in the middle of writing a different book. And I stopped in the middle of that, and I decided to write this one instead. And I started doing it because of what I saw happening to this country during the presidential campaign of 2016. I usually write as a scholar, or as a Christian, or as both. And this was an unusual thing for me. I was writing as a citizen. I wanted to write as someone who was concerned about my country. And what concerned me above all was the way in which people on both sides, or maybe I should say all sides, of our political spectrum were so eager to think the worst of those who disagreed with them. So eager to be suspicious, so eager to be hostile, so determined to seek those gotcha moments, and so determined to interpret what these other folks were doing in the most uncharitable way possible. And it turns out that there's a lot of research that's been done in recent years that shows how this works. I'm thinking of two papers in particular, and I quote both of these in my book. One of them says that the primary way in our culture, in our society, that people show their affiliation with a particular group is by showing how much they hate another group. That is, it turns out that the primary way in which we express our group affiliation is not saying, I agree with you, I'm on your side, but instead saying, I hate those people over there just as much as you do. So negativity is more important in group affiliation than positivity. The other study shows something that I think fits with that first one in an uncomfortable way. The other study says that when people are trying to show their identification with a particular group, then what they tend to do is to stake out the most extreme territory. That is, I don't just agree with you, but I doubly agree with you. I'm not just on your side, but I'm like farther in your direction than you are. And by doing that, they say, see, I'm a real believer. And so the way that those two things work together is you get situations where they say, oh, you hate these other people? I hate them more than you do. And so you get these perverse incentives of people to be hostile, to be uncharitable, to look for the worst possible way to interpret what somebody else says. And that's a problem. That concerns me. I began to realize, as I thought about these things, that one of the most important texts for me is a talk that C.S. Lewis gave in 1944 called The Inner Ring. And in The Inner Ring, he's actually giving a talk to a group of new graduates of King's College London. And he tells them that in his view, one of the strongest desires that they will ever face from the moment he's speaking to them until they are too old to care is the desire to belong to an inner ring, the desire to belong to a group of people that you admire, a desire to sit at the cool kids table, and a fear of being left out. And then Lewis also says that of all the desires that human beings have, this one, this desire to belong and this fear of being left out is the one that, he says, is most likely to make people who are not very bad people do very, very bad things. So great is the fear of being excluded, of not belonging. And that's what I decided I wanted to write about. I wanted to try to think about the power of the inner ring and about how we might resist it. And I want to think about it in our moment because I think of all those perverse incentives that I was just talking about, all the things that incline us towards being cruel or unjust or unfair to other people in order to signal our group affiliation. It seems to me that social media magnify that 1,000 times. Social media are megaphones so that we can shout our group affiliation and, more importantly, our disaffiliation, the people we don't want to belong to, the people we don't want to associate with. And I felt like that was something that I needed to address. But why did I think I was capable of addressing it? Some of it is just my 35 years as a teacher, and always trying to teach people to write more clearly and more cogently. But I actually feel that what helped me even more than that was my history as belonging to multiple communities. Because, see, I'm an academic, and I've been an academic for a long time, and I'm also a Christian, and I've been a Christian for a long time. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that academics don't tend to have very high opinions of Christians, and Christians don't tend to have very high opinions of academics. And so often, when I would be listening to my Christian friends and they would talk about what the people in the academy are like, I would think, well, yeah, that's sort of true, but that's actually not the whole truth. And then when my academic friends would talk about what Christians are like, I would say, well, yeah, some Christians can be that way, but not all of us, and it's actually more complicated than that. And so one of the things that I've developed over many years of belonging to these overlapping communities is a version of what the linguists call code switching. Code switching is, I say the linguists talk about it. I'm from Alabama. I lived in the suburbs of Chicago for 29 years. And one of the things that I learned was not to talk like somebody from Alabama. And then when I would come back to Alabama to visit my family, I would be, man, it's so good to be able to talk the way I grew up talking. I would just like slide right back into that, and I would become even more of a redneck than I naturally am. And then when I would move back up into the suburbs of Chicago again, I would begin to speak in a very articulate Midwestern sort of way. And that kind of code switching is something that we all do consciously or unconsciously, usually unconsciously. But this was something that I felt I needed to do culturally. I'd been doing it for a long time. So can I help people understand? Does my experience as someone who has many, many decades of code switching, can that help me bridge some of the gaps between communities where there's a lot of mutual hostility? So that was really what led me into this book. And I started thinking about how I wanted to do it. And there are certain things that I don't say in the book, but that I thought about right from the beginning. And so I'm going to tell you now. So this is a secret, okay? So I'm going to tell my secret here. I've always heard what happens in Abilene stays in Abilene. So I'm going to trust that's the way it's going to happen here, and that this will never get outside this room, despite the fact that I've got about 8 mics on me. And nevertheless, I'm going to tell you my secret. So whenever I write a book, I usually have in mind a kind of an ideal reader. Not necessarily the most sympathetic reader. I actually always try to think of someone I want to win over. Someone who's going to be suspicious. Someone who's not really going to agree. Because I think, what's the point of writing? What's the point of writing to people who already agree with you about everything? That doesn't seem like it's worth my time, though, given the dynamics I was just describing, there's a lot of that goes on. And I knew that because I was writing this book for a New York publisher, and given the reach of that publisher and how the marketing would work and all of that, then I would have a great many readers who were not Christians. In other words, people on that division between the academic and the Christian are probably more likely to be on the academic side rather than on the Christian side. And so I laid a little trap. Here's how it works. In my first chapter, I talk about a woman named Megan Phelps Roper, young woman who is I think the granddaughter of Fred Phelps, the man who led Westboro Baptist Church, which of course has been infamous for its, for instance, going to military funerals and mocking people, and also for a lot of other unsavory things. And the story that I wanted to tell is about how she was gradually brought to doubt whether her fundamentalist Christian upbringing at Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas, whether that fundamentalist upbringing might be wrong, whether indeed the truth about the world might be something certainly broader and probably rather different than what she had always been taught. And that is a story that all of my secular readers would be very familiar with. The idea that Christians are rigid and narrow-minded and don't see the bigger possibilities in the world and don't see all the options. And then the natural thing that happens to them is once they see that broader world, then they are cured of their fundamentalism and they're led into a more open, tolerant, and inclusive way of life. That's a very familiar story. And that does happen. And indeed, the story of Megan Phelps Roper is a story of someone who just assumed a lot of things and didn't think about it very much. And then when she did start to think about the things she had always assumed, she wasn't so sure whether they were true anymore. That's not where the trap is, though. The trap is in the next chapter. The next chapter is about another young woman, in fact, of almost exactly the same age as Megan Phelps Roper. And this young woman's name is Leah Labresco. And Leah Labresco grew up in Long Island in a family that had no religious belief whatsoever. She was very smart, very academically inclined, but not only were her family not religious in any way, she hardly knew anyone who had any substantive religious belief. She tells the story about how when she, in one high school class, they were studying the Protestant Reformation and the creation, Martin Luther's inadvertent creation of a new church, the Lutheran Church, and somebody in the class raised his hand and said, "Are there still Lutherans? Are there any of those still around?" And nobody in the class knew whether there were still any Lutherans or not, including Leah Labresco herself. That's how secular the world was that she grew up in. And then she went to college at Yale, and at Yale got involved in a group there called the Yale Political Union, where they conducted debates. And I've actually known a number of people who've been in the YPU, and they all love it for the same reasons. If you have been in the YPU for a while and you have participated in their debates, and you decide, maybe I'd like to have a leadership role in this society, then you can be interviewed for a leadership role. And when that happens, one of the things that they'll ask you many questions, but there are two questions they always ask. One is, have you ever broken anyone on the floor? That's a weird question, but to be broken on the floor in the terminology of the Yale Political Union is, have you ever, right in the middle of a debate, realized have you ever, right in the middle of a debate, convinced someone else that they were wrong? You broke them on the floor. That right in the middle of the debate, they had to say, wow, I think you're right and I'm wrong. So they want to know that about you. Are you a good enough debater? Are you a skilled enough debater that you can break somebody on the floor? But here's the next question. Have you ever been broken on the floor? Have you ever, in the middle of a debate, realized you were wrong and admitted it? Said it right there in front of God and everybody. I'm wrong. And here's the thing. Saying yes to that question is way more important than saying yes to the first one. If you have broken somebody on the floor, that's good, that's fine. That maybe says something about your rhetorical skill, your deliberative skill. But the real question is whether you have been broken on the floor, because that's the test of your character. Are you the sort of person who can say, yep, I'm wrong, you got me. I thought I knew what was right about this, but I don't. I'm going to have to go back and rethink. If that's your attitude, then you could be a leader. And Leah Libresco internalized that. She internalized that attitude. And then another thing happened to her. She started running into some really thoughtful Christians at Yale. And she realized, because because of her time in the YPU had sensitized her to debates and how they work, she realized, I've never actually even thought about whether Christianity might be true. I've always just assumed that it's false. But I haven't actually investigated. I haven't actually thought it through. I haven't talked to someone or debated someone who really knows what Christians believe and why they believe it. So she said, maybe I should do that. And as she got into these conversations with people, she found out they were a whole lot smarter than she thought they were, and that they knew their stuff way better than she thought they did. And she began to realize that she actually didn't have any good reasons for refusing Christianity. And that set her on a path, because she was willing, when she was having debates with Christians, she was willing to be broken on the floor and to say, I don't have an answer to that. I don't have a response to that. I'm not sure what I think. I need to go back and reflect on this more. Because she did that, she set herself on a path that led to her becoming a Christian. So you see what I did? I tried in that first chapter to give my non-believing readers a story they're familiar with. The story of a narrow-minded fundamentalist who opens up her mind and begins to question what she had always been taught. And then, in the second chapter, I flipped the script. And now, it's not the narrow-minded Christian, it's the narrow-minded atheist who also has never really questioned what she was taught, and who opens herself up to the possibility of something being true that she had never really expected could be. And my point in doing that was to say to my non-believing readers, if you do start really thinking, you don't know where it's going to lead you. You don't know where it's going to go. You are just as vulnerable as the most narrow-minded, rigid fundamentalist once you open the possibilities of something being true that you haven't suspected before. I wanted my non-believing readers to see it that way, but I couldn't do it by just launching right into that. I had to give them a more familiar and comfortable example first, one that told a story that they like, and then say, yeah, but let's flip this script. And it turns out it's just as true on the other side as it is. It's just as true for Leah Libresco as it is for Megan Phelps Roper. That once you begin questioning your long-held assumptions, you don't know where you're going to end up. So that's my secret, that I was doing a little pre-evangelism there, just trying to get people to think a little bit about these issues. And I think the upshot of that for all of us, it seems to me, is that in both cases, these were young women who had communities that they belonged to, communities that gave them some of their identity, gave them some sense of what life was all about, gave them affirmation, Megan Phelps Roper was affirmed by her community for holding the views of Westboro Baptist Church, but equally so, Leah Labresco was affirmed by her community for not being a Christian, for not taking religion seriously, for not even pursuing religious ideas because they're so obviously wrong. And that's the way it is for all of us. When we genuinely reflect on the possibilities that are available to us, we put ourselves at risk. And we put ourselves at risk not just intellectually, but also socially. And if C.S. Lewis is right, and if all those other people whose studies I've quoted are right, then in many ways it's being put at risk socially that is the thing that we're most afraid of, or the thing that most people are most afraid of. That we don't want to have people we care about turn their backs on us. We don't want to have them look at us with horror or disgust or even pity. We want to be affirmed. We want to belong. And that is the most natural thing in the world, and it is appropriate for human beings. We are social creatures. We are made to live in community, in fellowship with one another. The problem is to distinguish the difference. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about this, between an inner ring and a genuine community. And here's how you can tell the difference. The inner ring is a group that won't let you think. The inner ring is a group that won't let you question. The inner ring is a group that demands conformity. Whereas you know that you are in a genuine community if people are willing to listen to your questions. And you know that you are participating in a genuine community if you're doing your part to make something a genuine community, if you are willing to listen to other people's questions. Not to be threatened by their doubts, not to be threatened by their puzzlements, but to be generous and kind, to be able to listen. There are those of us who need to have the courage to express our convictions, and then there are those of us who need to have the patience and forbearance to listen to the questions of others. And if we're doing those things, if everybody is doing those things, then we have a genuine community. Then it's not an inner ring. Then you don't get thrown out the first time you say something that you're not supposed to. But instead, you are still welcomed into the community. Now, it may be nobody's going to make you the leader of that community. But if you want to belong, you can belong. If you want to ask, people will listen. And if people do ask, you're on the other end of that, then you are willing to listen. You are willing to try to interact with them, even though it might put some of your comforts at risk. This is why I say in the book, and this is maybe the single most important thing I say in the book, people are always telling you to think for yourself. You cannot think for yourself. It is not possible for any of us to think for ourselves. We always think with others. And so one of the big questions that we need to face is, who are the people around us who are good to think with? Who are the people who are good to think with? One of the reasons that Leah Labresco found herself so drawn to the Yale Political Union is that they were good people to think with. And how did she know that they were good people to think with? Because when she was broken on the floor and said, "I'm wrong, I'm just wrong. I thought I had it, thought I had a good argument, thought I had a strong position. I don't, I'm wrong." They didn't cast her out. They didn't think less of her. In fact, they thought more of her. So I think that's what the upshot is for us, that we all need to take the risks of participating in community in a way that is both encouraging of those who struggle and open when we ourselves struggle. That's the only way that thinking is really going to happen. And that's hard because we don't want to put our social affiliations at risk. And that's why the very last words of my book are, be brave, because I think that's what is called for here. I want to say one last thing in conclusion. These particular risks are always especially present in any educational community, any community of learning. Ideas are being debated, assertions are being questioned, beliefs are being put into context or challenged in some way. It is a continually risky endeavor. And so all of us who are participating in communities of learning, whether that's at a university like ACU, or whether that's in a high school or an elementary school, or whether it's in a local book group, or whether it's in Sunday school at church, wherever it is, we really need to learn to be patient and forbearing and honest. If we can be patient and forbearing and honest, then we can build communities in which real thinking is possible. I cannot tell you that that is a safe endeavor. It is not. It isn't safe, but it's good. Thank you very much.